Hey everybody, this is Brian Smith with Grief to Growth, your host of Grief to Growth, and I'm here today with Debra Diamond. Debra has a fascinating background. She is a former money market manager, and I'll let her talk about that in more detail. She is a medium, and she's also what's known as a death doula. And Debra's written a book called Diary of a Death Doula, 25 Lessons the Dying Teaches About the Afterlife. And I have read an advanced copy of the book, and I have to say it's one of the most unique books I've read because of her perspective as both a medium and a death doula. So with that, I want to welcome Debra Diamond.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Debra, I want to talk a little bit about your background and how you got into the whole mediumship thing. But even before that, because you've got like I said, really interesting background. You're not one of those, well, I hate to say, woo-woo kind of people.
Yeah.
You're a very grounded person. You've got a PhD. So tell me about your background.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I have a kind of left brain background. I guess I'm a left brain medium, but I was a money manager on Wall Street for many, many years. I was also a commentator on CNBC and a professor in the graduate school at Johns Hopkins University. So I come out of that sort of background and did a lot of research in my career as well. I have an MBA in finance, and I also have a PhD. So that's my background.
Mm-hmm.
I had never really planned on being a psychic and a medium. It's nothing that I ever said. When I was a kid, I never said, geez, I wish I can grow up and become a psychic. I didn't even know what a psychic was. But when I was in the investment business, I always knew things. We would get, in the investment business every day, we would get a big delivery, big stack like this of reports, research reports, annual reports, prospectuses, and I wouldn't have to read them to know anything about the companies. I would pick up a prospectus and I would just know about the company and the management and the industry, if it would be a good investment. And I didn't know how that was possible. And of course, those kinds of conversations about knowing what goes on maybe in the invisible world, that never occurs on Wall Street. That's just not part of the vernacular. So
Right.
I had no idea what it was. Now, my boss used to say, Debra, you have really good instincts. So I thought that must be it. It's just good instincts. And that's about as far as I went. I was busy. I was juggling 20 balls in the air, 3 kids, a husband, traveling all the time. My clients were all in Europe, so I was always going back and forth to Europe. So I was busy. But in 2007, I decided to take an intuition development class in New York because I figured I had pretty good intuition, and wouldn't it be fun to kind of tune it up a little bit? So I signed up for this weekend class, and I live in Baltimore, by the way, so it's a few hours from New York. And I went up to New York for the weekend. And Saturday morning in the class, there were about 25 people, men and women. I didn't know any of them. And we did a number of exercises, and I was getting everything in these exercises. I didn't know how that was possible, but they were fairly low-key exercises, so I wasn't too concerned about it. We took a break, and when we came back, the teacher said, now we're going to do a seance. And I was like, a seance? No, I mean, I came for intuition development, and I checked the schedule, and I'm thinking, this is scary. I don't want to do this. But then I thought, well, it was Saturday morning. This is my cat. It's Saturday morning. And if, nothing's going to happen anyway, and we'll just go on to the next exercise. So the teacher said, I'm going to put you in a meditative state, and then I'll take everybody out of the meditation. And if you see anything, you let me know, and I'll tell you what to do. And I thought, well, that doesn't pertain to me. So, we meditated. She brought us out of the meditation. She said, does anyone see anything? And everyone, I looked around the room, everyone was looking at each other, and I raised my hand, and she said, yes, Debra, what do you see? And I said, I see about 50 people. These were people who had passed. I was seeing relatives of mine who had passed. I was seeing loved ones of the other people in the class who had passed. And then random people, including a couple 42nd Street showgirls just kind of prancing through the room, who the teacher saw as well. So anyway, the teacher said, if you see someone in the corner of the room, chances are they go with someone sitting in that corner. And I said, well, I do see someone in the corner. And the teacher asked me to describe that person. And I said he had black hair, part in the middle, handlebar mustache, big white teeth. And as I described him, the woman sitting in that corner began to sob. And she said, I know who that is. That's my fiance. He died 2 years ago. And she asked if I could identify him. She showed me a picture on her cell phone during the break. So I said yes, because I mean, it's like saying, can I identify Brian? Yeah, I'm looking right at you. Sure, I could identify you. So during the break, she came over and she flipped through pictures on her cell phone. And I said, there, that's him. And she said, yes, that's my fiance. He looked exactly like I saw him. And so she said, she had wanted to hear from him for 2 years. She thought he would come in somehow and she would have contact with him, and she had not had any contact with him. So she was very grateful to me for what had happened. Now, remember, I come from Wall Street. So, this was all new to me. She gave me a big hug and she thanked me. And there are no hugs on Wall Street, no thank yous either. So I was, really overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But I did understand that I had done something profound for somebody, something meaningful for somebody. And that really registered. So we spent the rest of the weekend in the class. We did do another seance. I did have contact with more people in that seance. And I was very overwhelmed and didn't understand really what was happening. But I drove home Sunday night to Baltimore. And people were coming up to me in the class and saying, you must have been doing this for a long time. And I said, I've never done this before. So I hadn't done it before. I didn't know, but anyway, I drove home Sunday night. I called my youngest son when I drove home. I called him to kind of get his take on it, because he is very logical. He scores really high in logic tests. He's a second-year MBA student at Duke right now. So that gives you sort of, very left brain. Yeah. So I called him and I told him what happened. And he said, he listened. He listened to the whole story. When I was all done, he said, well, that makes sense. We're just energy, and the energy has to go somewhere. And I was like, okay. I mean, first of all, that calmed me down a bit. And secondly, it gave me a template to understand and to look at, what had happened. He also didn't invalidate it. He didn't say, oh, that didn't happen. Right. So that was good. And I've used that understanding that we are energy and everything is energy. That's kind of infused my work since then, because it's a cross between science and spirituality, and everything is energy. And I found, in my work as a medium and as a death doula, our essence doesn't die. We continue. And, our physical body may die, but we continue. Our essence, our energy continues. And the first demonstration of that was when I was in that class in New York. And since then, I've been involved thousands and thousands of times with people, doing work as a medium or in my work as a death doula, where I've, seen this. Yeah. So, and, look, I come from a very left brain background. I'm, not your typical, as you said, woo-woo kind of medium or psychic. Right. But I feel like somebody wants me to do this work. For some reason I'm doing this work, and maybe it's because I have this background I also have, I have a background in research. So it's the work is satisfying, and I'm glad that I can help people. Yeah. I never really felt that way on Wall Street. So it's just to have people tell me that I changed their lives or I did something so important for them that's pretty special. And so I'm happy that I can do that.
So how did you transition from Wall Street to becoming a professional medium?
Yeah, so it wasn't easy. And, people who've gone through spiritually transformative experiences or near-death experiences will tell you that their lives are pretty much flipped upside down. Mm-hmm. And some of them go kicking and screaming, and, and then there are others who are more welcoming, and then there are those who are in between. This was not my idea. I mean, when this happened to me, I was very much, no, thank you. My life is set. This is not really what I have in mind. Right. I after what happened to me in that class, I came back to Baltimore. I didn't tell anybody what happened because people don't talk about these experiences. That summer, I decided to go to Taos, New Mexico for a couple months to paint because I'm also an artist. And I rented a place for 2 months with the idea that I was going out there to paint. And when the 2 months were up, my lease was up, I said, well, I'm not going back to Baltimore. I didn't know why. I just knew I wasn't going back. So I rented another place and I ended up staying for a number of years. And that's where I unpacked everything that happened. But I did it in a way that I didn't even know I was doing it, because this kind of work is normalized, in a place like Taos or, any high vibration environment. It's normalized. If somebody asks you in Taos, what do you do? And you say, I'm a psychic. They say, oh, me too.
Yeah.
So, you don't even think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I relaxed and started to do the work, and I started training, and I started eventually doing readings and teaching workshops. So that's what happened. It took a number of years.
Yeah.
And again, it wasn't what I had in mind. I mean, I spent a lot of years training for my chosen profession, which was
Sure.
a money manager.
Yeah.
And it's, one of those pyramid things, and it's hard to get to the top of the pyramid, but I was there. So, the idea that I would step off of that and go be a psychic, I think a lot of people thought I lost my marbles.
I'm sure you got that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on a daily basis now, you're practicing mediumship as a profession. Is that correct?
Well, I'm a psychic and a medium.
Okay.
I don't know so not everybody is familiar with the difference.
Yeah,
between
let's talk about the differences, because not everybody knows.
Yeah. So psychics are able to retrieve information about things that affect all of us in life on Earth. So in other words, family, career, health, money, relationships, these sorts of things that face all of us in life. Mm-hmm. Mediums are able to connect with those who've passed over. Mm-hmm. So mediums have to go higher to make that connection. I mean, think of us as like a radio tower or a TV tower, where we have to reach higher to get that signal for someone who's passed over. All mediums are psychics, but not all psychics are mediums. Psychics are, retrieve information from lower realms. Mediums retrieve information from higher realms. So there is a difference.
I like the way you put that. I've never heard that before, the lower and the higher, because I've heard mediums talk about some mediums who think they're mediums are actually getting things psychically.
Yeah.
And so you talked about so there's a difference between connecting with someone on this side and someone's on the other side. They're at a higher level.
Yeah, it's picking up that information about, your job or your friend or your relationship. That's kind of earth-based information. But people who've passed over are in another dimension, and getting that information, making that connection requires a higher vibration. You have to go to a different place.
Interesting.
And so it's a higher connection than psychic information. I mean, psychic ability is nothing but a amped up form of intuition. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I do both psychic and mediumship, and I also do medical intuition. As a matter of fact, I was in an expo over the weekend, and somebody was asking me. Somebody stopped by and asked what I do, and I explained psychic, mediumship, medical intuition. She said, "What do you mean by medical intuition?" And I said, "Well, for instance," and I reached out and I touched her back. I said, I see things, that going on with your physical body. Like what is it right here with your back? I see something. And she said, "How did you know to touch me on that exact spot?" That's where I have a problem. And I said, "Because I see things, that I'm able to do that." So I do medical intuition as well.
So this all came after you opened up in that workshop, but obviously it was a lot of work too. You were out in Taos and you spent several years developing the ability.
Yeah, and I trained. So, people think because they watch television shows about psychics and mediums and movies that, oh, geez, they must just sit there and then, all this stuff just appears to them naturally and they know everything. Well, it's sort of like, do you play a musical instrument?
I have, yes.
Okay, so if I gave you some sheet music and said, go off and play this, and you'd never had a lesson, you probably wouldn't be able to do that.
Right.
But if I said, here's some music, go practice, you'd come back and you'd be able to do it. This is like learning a foreign language. You have to practice. You might have the ability, but you still have to practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know I got an email from someone the other day saying she said, I'm now doing mediumship and I'm having a terrible time. I don't physically feel well and I'm having all these reactions. And my question was, what kind of training have you done? Because I think a lot of people are opening up and they just assume, well, I'm open, so now I can just go do this. But you have to, I think there's some training that has to take place so that you know how to protect yourself and you know how to work with the energy.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
so that's what I did. I trained at many places, including the Arthur Findlay College in the UK, and you've probably met some mediums who've trained at Arthur Findlay. It's a very intense place. People come from all over the world to train there, and they have some slogans like Tearful Tuesday and Weepy Wednesday, because by the time you get to that part of the program, everybody's just in tears all the time. But it's you have to learn how to, as I said, to work with the energy. So that's what I did, and it was a process.
Yeah, for sure. So went from Wall Street to mediumship, medical intuitive, psychic, and then you became a death doula. And that's another term I think that people are not going to be familiar with. I think people have heard of birth doulas, but tell me what a death doula is.
Yeah, you're correct. So birth doulas, midwives usher life in, and death doulas usher life out of the world. So, doulas bookend life, life coming in and life leaving.
Mm-hmm.
Death doulas it's a fairly new term. Not everybody is familiar with it. There's probably only a few thousand in the world right now. We don't know for sure how many there are, but the idea is gaining a lot of attention. And I feel like a lot of people, when they hear about it, say, maybe this is something I can do. So there are training programs where people are training to be doulas. And doulas can do anything from help with wills, help with funeral arrangements, assist the families, to sitting bedside with somebody at hospice or in the hospital. Or in my case, I sit with the actively dying at hospice. And actively dying means people who are 24 to 48 hours from death. Now, doctors don't always get it right. So, sometimes they say 48 hours and the person could still be there a month later. But in general, these patients are non-responsive. And so I'm not doing like crossword puzzles with them or reading to them or anything like that. And one of the functions of death doulas that do the kind of work that I do is that we're the eyes and ears of the medical staff, because the nurses can't be there all the time. Mm-hmm. They have many patients, and the families also don't want their loved one to die alone. And one thing that I've seen is that in our culture, people are afraid of death. Death is stigmatized and there's a taboo around it. People would rather walk over hot coals and talk about death. Mm-hmm. And when someone goes to hospice, in many cases, family and loved ones don't want to come visit anymore because they want to remember mom like she used to be, or they're afraid. Many of them are afraid. So sometimes they don't have many visitors. But they want their loved one, they want someone to be there with their loved one. So knowing that there's someone who's there with them, I think provides comfort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had heard of death doulas before, and I know that they do a lot of those things you mentioned, like work with the family, funeral arrangements, things like that. In the book, you talk mostly about the sitting. So is that because that's what you concentrate on in the book, or is that pretty much what you do, is the sitting with the actively dying?
I missed a little bit of what you said. In the book, I talk mostly about sitting with...
Mostly about sitting with the actively dying, not the other helping make funeral arrangements.
Right.
Is that because that's what you're doing in particular?
Yes, that's what I do. So yeah, there are other doulas who are much more involved from sort of a social work aspect. There's an organization called INELDA, the International Organization of End of Life Death Doulas, and that organization was founded by a social worker. So the doulas who are being trained in that organization are doing legacy projects or working with the families. But the training that I did for hospice was initially I trained to be a, just to be a volunteer working with the dying. But then I took extra coursework to be a death doula that would sit with the actively dying, and it's compartmentalized. It's a different, it's really a different job, different function. So that's my work, just sitting with them when they're actively dying. And if I notice that there's any change, with the patient, I would inform the medical staff. The family members and loved ones who come by want to know if everything's okay. So, part of the job is letting them know that everything is proceeding as it should. Because, many people have never been around anyone who's dying.
Right.
Ever. In our culture, it's not like it was 100 years ago or 150 years ago when people died at home surrounded by their loved ones. I mean, today people are spread all over the place and your loved ones may not be nearby.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I interviewed Barbara Carnes a few weeks ago, and she's a hospice nurse and been hospice nurse since almost kind of first came to this country. So it was really interesting talking to her. And she mentioned the death doulas and I guess the increased role because the hospice nurses are becoming overworked, like a lot of people in the medical profession. So she was saying that death doulas play a very important role in, assisting with those things, like you said, kind of being the eyes and the ears and having the time to really sit with the family and with the person that's crossing over.
Yeah.
So this brings us to our really excited to go is talking about your book, which is Diary of a Death Doula, 25 Lessons a Dying Teach Us About the Afterlife. So we've established what a doula is. But the thing is about this book that I found, well, first of all, it's just a great book. You're a very good author. But the perspective that you bring as a medium, because in this book I'm seeing what I've been called shared crossing experiences, where every once in a while when someone's crossing, a loved one might be fortunate enough to kind of get a glimpse across the veil and see what's going on. And it sounds like for you, this is a pretty common occurrence. You're like actually navigating both worlds at the same time. So you're describing in the book what's happening with the person's body that's there, but also what's happening with their spirit as they're making that crossing. I thought that for someone that's looking at the body and saying, what happened to my loved one? Where did they go? Why they don't look like themselves? They're breathing weird, are they in discomfort? The perspective you're able to bring was just tremendously comforting.
Thank you. Well, in our culture, we have a very material culture. So we define things materially. When we look at a physical body and the physical body doesn't look so good, to us, that's death, right? That signifies death. But there's more to death and dying than just a physical body. And the reason I got into this work initially was because when my mom was dying in 2001, we had hospice come to the house. And I'd never been around anyone who died before, ever. So, and I remember the hospice professional handed me a piece of paper and she said, you might want to read this. And I thought maybe it had something to do with medicine or even funeral arrangements, and I set it aside. But when I finally picked it up and read it, it said, if the body's ready and the soul isn't, you don't leave. And if the soul's ready and the body isn't, you don't leave. But if the body's ready and the soul's ready, then you leave. And I was very struck by that death was a process. It wasn't just about the physical body. So, I knew then that I wanted to do something to be of service, that I wanted to get involved in hospice. I just didn't know what it was. But I thought about what she said, and I actually thought about it for 15 years. It took me a while to kind of do what I was going to do. But that idea of death as a process, I think, is the foundation of what I do. And it's the foundation of the book, because it's more than just, as you said, someone looks at the physical body and they're breathing weird or they don't look right, and we think that's it. But in fact, there's so much more going on. There's more in the invisible world going on than anyone can see. Most people don't see into the invisible world. They just see that physical body. Excuse me. So, I had dinner a few weeks ago with a friend of mine who's a hospice chaplain in Albuquerque.
Mhm.
And she said, tell me in a couple sentences about your book. And I said, well, first of all, there's more going on in the invisible world than anyone understands. And number two, we don't die. Our essence continues, and that was shown to me over and over and over again with these patients, because I'm able to see both sides. I'm able to see that. So I see their bodies journeying, and I see loved ones in spirit come into the rooms. They're always in the rooms. And people have asked, what about people, folks who've died from trauma? What about them? Because that's different. You don't usually get that so much in hospice.
Mhm.
Um, but I can tell you as a medium, um, for those who pass of trauma, their loved ones also come in. I mean, especially with children, there's always, like, the grandparents come in, or an aunt or uncle or whoever's on the other side. They're there. They come
Mhm.
in.
Mhm.
So, and they're not left alone on the other side either. So it's just kind of like it is here, But um, when I was talking to my friend, the hospice chaplain, I said to her, um, people who have NDEs or STEs, they have these experiences and they come back with their energy altered, with their consciousness altered. They come back with more consciousness. So let's just say, for example, and I'm completely making this up, but let's say you're 98% physical body and 2% consciousness. Then you have one of these experiences, an NDE or an STE. You come back now you're maybe 95% physical body and 5% consciousness. You've got more consciousness. It's been altered. Your
Mhm.
energy's been altered. Well, the same thing happens at end of life. Um, you know, we're still 95% or 98% physical body, but as we go through the end of life process, we journey to higher dimensions. And when we come back from those journeys, we're a little bit different. We come back with a little more higher consciousness. And until we finally pass, at which point there's not as much there's like no physical body left, but our consciousness has bloomed. We're 110% or 1,010% consciousness. When I said this to my friend, the hospice chaplain, she said, that makes sense, because she said, I talk to these patients all the time and they journey. She says, every time I talk to them, after they have one of these journeys, they're a little bit different.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there that shift is going on, into,
Yeah,
yeah. So
and I
it's,
think that's an important point, because I think we think of, and I want to go back a little bit, because at the beginning of the book you talk about the history of death, and you talk about science, you talk about religion, and how our perspectives on death can change. And I think now we've got a very scientific perspective that when the brain stops, or the heart stops, or the brain and the heart stop, that's the moment that you cross.
uh-huh.
But one of the things that's fascinating about your book is we find out it's not that. It's a process that can go on for days or even weeks, where people are back and forth. And what we assume are hallucinations, when they say, I just saw Joe, or, I'm packing my bags, or things like that, these are things that are actually happening, and there you can see into that realm.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. um we yeah, the people are terrified of death, and it's because it's become so medicalized. Most
Right.
people, as they become, it gets near the end, they're taken to some clinical setting. And death, in the eyes of the medical or scientific community, is considered a failure. So they try to do everything they can to keep that person alive. But it's it's not death wasn't always treated that way. If you go back to ancient cultures, the way we treat death today is really an anomaly compared to how they did
It
in ancient
is. It,
cultures. If you go back, I don't care if you go to Mesopotamia, if you go to ancient Egypt, if you go to the to the Yucatan, to the Maya culture, any of these cultures. And it's interesting because they all were at different points in time all around the world, and they didn't have texting or cell phones to talk to each other, but yet they were doing the same things. The dead were part of their lives. They considered them living. In fact, in the Inca culture, they strapped them to a chair and they carried them around with them, and they took them to parties, and they would consult them, what should we do about this or that? And in the Mayan culture and in ancient Egypt, they buried them under the living room floors, and they had pictures and death masks in the living room of their loved one. They were still with them. They were treated as if they're just still here. We don't do that anymore. As soon as someone gets sick, they put them away into hospital or hospice. We don't see them again. But I'm hoping that this book, Diary of a Death Doula, will get the conversation started in terms of how we view death. And there is a movement now, a death positive movement, and death cafes. I don't know if they have them where you are, but there's quite a few of them around where I am, and it's to get people talking about death. And there's no judgment involved. People have different ideas and feelings about it, but it's just to get the conversation started.
Well, one of the things I've learned as I've studied the whole history of this is that this materialistic atheism, I'll call it, and with the emphasis on materialistic, is a recent phenomenon. I mean, it's the last couple hundred years. Mm-hmm. All of mankind up to this point, as you said, have kind of viewed death as a passage. And we've said, okay, if I'm just my body, if I'm an accident of nature, I started to exist the moment I took that first breath. I cease to exist the moment I take that last breath. That's where all the fear comes from. And in our culture, we think that's the way it's always been. I mean, or we're so advanced, we've finally figured this out. But what I find also interesting is science is starting to come back around with things like quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And, some of the researchers are coming up and saying, this universe isn't as mechanistic as we think it is. And there's a lot more going on than we know. And we still haven't solved what they call the hard problem of consciousness, which is, why are we conscious at all if we're just material? So I think your book will go a long way towards helping people to see a different perspective and understand about what death really is, and it's not the ultimate failure.
Yeah, I think you're I agree with you, and we do live in a very materialistic, everybody defines things by their senses, what we can feel and touch and see and all that. But there is so much more that goes on. And I think because of some of the changes we're seeing now in science and even like in the space exploration program, where they're saying, oh, wait a second, there seems to be more going on there than we thought. We're not sure what it is, but it's something else. Right. So I think all of that is good. But it is funny to me that, we consider ourselves so advanced, and yet these ancient cultures seem much more advanced to me about how they treated a lot of things
when it comes to the important questions. Yeah. And my background is chemical engineering, so I'm a scientific person myself. I'm left brain and everything. But the way I look at it is, our senses can only sense a certain percentage of the visible spectrum, for example, our eyesight, and our ears can only hear a certain percentage of the audible spectrum. We don't know what the world would even look like if we were able to open that up. I mean, we literally don't know what it would look like. So I look at someone like yourself and I say, you've just developed a sense that the rest of us haven't developed to that level. And you're able to peer behind or peer across that veil and see what's going on. It's not woo-woo. And I was talking to someone earlier today and I used the word spiritual, my approach. And I said, I don't like even really using that word because it makes it sound like it's religious. And it's not. What we call it, we don't understand yet, we're calling spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. And, I'm able to see more than some people, but look, let's be real here. Mediums and psychics, we still are bound by, we have earthly bodies, and right. There's only, I could see more than some people, but I'm not Superwoman, right. And I don't have access to everything. Right. What I do is natural to me, which is a funny thing because I guess you can get used to anything. But, it's natural to me now. But, and there are so many people who are awakening now. There's a big shift going on right now, and it seems to be affecting all of mankind. So there are more and more people who are able to do what I do. They're just opening up. Their consciousness is opening up. And that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I think so. So you have 25 lessons in the book. I know we can't go through all of them, but could you pick like maybe one or two of your favorites and kind of tell us, what things we can learn from the book?
Yeah. So, my favorite is one of the first lessons, and I've already mentioned that death is a process involving body and soul. it's not just, your body. It's not, and when I think of that, I think of people walking into the room of a hospice patient who is lying there unresponsive, and they back out of the room. The visitor backs out of the room. They're just terrified. But what could be going on there with that patient is they could be visiting Uncle Joe and having a wonderful time, So, but the visitor doesn't see that. But it is a process, and two things have to take place. And we are more than our physical bodies. We are our consciousness and our physical bodies. So, it's important I think to keep that in mind. And some of your listeners may agree with me, and some of them don't. I'm not trying to convert anybody.
Right.
I'm just putting this in my perspective out there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important. I think it's also important to understand that that we journey at end of life as we transition, and it's so fascinating. And you alluded to this earlier. Our journeying is very customized to each of us and to our consciousness. How does our consciousness know how to produce these journeys that are so unique to each of us? It's sort of like in the NDE world, if you expect to see Buddha, you're going to see Buddha. If you expect to see Jesus, you're going to get Jesus. Well, the same thing happens at end of life. When you're traveling at end of life, your journey is very much customized to your memories and to what's important to you. Mm-hmm. And so you're not getting somebody else's memories. You're getting only what's important to you. How does that happen? I don't have the slightest idea. But I can tell you that it happens. And I know it because I've, sat with people at end of life and seen the journeys that they've taken. And I don't know a whole lot about these patients, but sometimes I'll read their obituaries. And when I read the obituaries, it's like, oh, wow, they talked, I saw this in their journey, and here it is, in the obituary, this is what they did for a living. So, it's a very customized approach, and so I think that's another lesson. And one of the last lessons in the book is that people can will themselves to die, and that's something that I've seen as well, when they want to be with their loved one at end of life, and they just don't want to be here anymore. And I'm sure many people have stories about that. And let's see what else. Your senses. I think it's important to understand that people's senses are pretty much intact at end of life. There have been cases where I've sat bedside with the dying, and a loved one runs into the room. I had one person run into the room and say, "Is she dead yet?" And I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "Well, this is what happened when my other parent died. And so I was thinking maybe she was dead." And I was like, "Okay, she can hear you." And then the woman, the family member sat down and started talking about, we're planning the funeral, and the patient is lying there. Now the patient's not responsive, but she can hear everything.
Yes.
So I think you need to be careful. This is not the time to, I think for people who are coming to visit someone in hospice, it's nice to be peaceful and obviously to communicate with them and maybe tell them that you love them. It's not the time to work out family dynamics. Right. And they can hear you. And, according to medical literature, hearing is the last sense to go. But I kind of feel like all the senses are there, because there's anecdotal evidence that they're very much in tune with what's happening in that mm-hmm. room. And, mm-hmm. People who, I sat with someone who, I remember the hospice nurse came in and told this patient, your daughter can't come at 4:00 today. She's going to come early. She's going to be here at 3:00. This guy didn't have a watch on. He was totally unresponsive. And at a couple minutes to 3, he passed. Mm-hmm. People sometimes like to pass in privacy. They don't want their loved ones there. Now, how did he know it was a couple minutes to 3? I think they're much more in tune than we give them credit for.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, because I've dealt with dementia personally in my life. So when people are going through dementia, a lot of times we'll look at their bodies and say, okay, they're gone. They're not the same person they were. Have you had experience with patients with dementia and what it's like for them to cross?
Yeah, I've had some experience with patients with dementia, and what I've seen is it's a little bit different for them. But I mean, I can't say that their essence continues. That it's in there.
Hmm.
And I see them journeying, and I see them going through the same stages that someone else would go through who didn't have dementia. Um, and I've also, because I read for a lot of people as a medium, um, I've brought in a lot of folks who've passed and had dementia, and when they come into the readings, they're perfectly fine.
Hmm.
They're
Yeah.
they're fine. My dad had Alzheimer's, and I remember many years ago, before I started doing this, I went to a medium, and well, actually, she was a psychic. She wasn't a medium, and she said to me, I think I have your father here, but I've never done this before. And I guess my dad wanted to come in to communicate. And I said, well, go ahead. And she
Mhm.
said, well, he's saying he's fine and he can walk again. And he was restricted to his bed for 3 years before he
Mhm.
passed. And he said, oh, I'm fine. He was just like him too. So, so yeah, their essence is their essence. It's still there. Any issues with their physical body or issues with their physical body. It's not issue with
Right.
their consciousness.
So I wanted to ask you, as I'm reading the book, you're describing these things like visions almost. Do you see objectively, or is this in your mind's eye, or how do you see these things?
I see them the same way as I see things in readings. And I guess you would say in my mind's eye, or how
Hmm.
somebody might see something in a dream.
Hmm.
It's so real, it's so vivid, it's right there. It's taking place in my consciousness, and I just have some ability to connect and bring that in so that I'm able to see it and hear it, and you know and be there with it.
Okay.
I assume it's in my consciousness. I don't know if there is a term for where all
Yeah.
this stuff happens.
Yeah. And so there were a couple of things I observed in the book, and I want to make sure I understood it correctly. So it sounds like as our loved ones are journeying and they're meeting their loved ones who have already crossed, is it like an in between place where they're meeting? So they're not fully over to where
Yeah.
their final destination is, but they're meeting at a place in between. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to describe because, we're so used to thinking in linear terms.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
have people ask me these questions like, how many layers are there? How many
Yeah.
dimensions are there? I mean, I don't know. It's the universe, it's infinite. I don't know how many dimensions are. But I mean, I know that they're not in their final place yet. I know
Right.
they're in this place where they're still kind of they're connected to the earth, or they're connected with their memory. They're not there, they're not all the way to the other side, because if they were on the other side, it's pretty clear when they're on the other side that they're in a different place. I can't
Yeah.
describe it to you, but I can tell you, because it's just a different place.
It reminded me of the NDE experience. I've heard a lot of NDEers say I was in this place and I knew that I couldn't go past a certain point. It was like,
Mm.
so my impression has always been like there's a kind of a middle place or something. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Swedenborg. He talks about the
Yeah,
world of spirits. So that's kind of place where we all go when we first cross before we go to our final destinations.
yeah. They hmm. With NDEs, I've studied NDEs. My first book, Life After Near Death, was about people who had near death experiences and came back with unusual abilities and gifts they didn't have prior to their NDE.
Hmm.
I feel like the NDE, and I think you and I talked about this at one point. I feel like it's obviously different than terminal death, but I feel like it's like the highlights or the previews of the movie.
Yeah.
You get like three or five things that are like wow, big wow factor, and then you come back. And I think that's because these are meant to be teaching experiences. I
Hmm.
think they're meant to be learning experiences. I think they're meant for these people are coming back. They're coming back,
Right. Right.
and to have the maximum impression on them, they give them the big wow factor on a couple things, and that's what they return with, and that's why they come back one of the reasons they come back transformed. Actual physical terminal death is a little bit different because it can go on for days, weeks, months,
Right.
and there are many experiences that the person can generate in their consciousness over that period of time.
Hmm.
So, in terms of levels, I don't know how many levels there are.
Yeah.
I just know that they are having different experiences, journeying, going to maybe to memories of when they were growing up. If they had if there was something about their when they were children that they want to revisit, they may be visiting favorite places, of their life. If they're very religious, they may go to some other dimension and see a church or cathedral, something that they would never see here on Earth. It's so, consciousness is unlimited and the
Right.
universe is unlimited. So, I mean, how do we put parameters on it? How do we put levels on it?
Yeah,
Hard enough to figure that
I
out.
just had the impression of like this kind of in between. Not that there was. I mean, I hear people talk about 7 levels. I'm like, how would you know that? But
Yeah.
I just got the feeling that, like, I think a lot of people think it's binary. You're here or you're in heaven, and
Mm.
it seemed like there was a place where they kind of meet, with their loved ones before they make the final
Well,
crossing.
yeah, I mean, the loved ones are in the rooms, first of
Right,
all.
right.
They come into the rooms, and it's sort of like, it always reminds me of, if you've ever visited someone in the hospital, you might sort of stand to the side a little bit, maybe you don't interfere, you don't say, well, some people might, but you need to do this or you need to do that, but you're supportive and you're there, right?
Mhm,
And that's pretty much how the loved ones in spirit are. They come
mhm,
in, they may be at the foot of the bed, they may be in the corner, they're there. They're not urging anybody to leave, but
mhm.
the patient knows that they're there, and they see them and they speak to them. Oftentimes they speak to them, but they're not. They're there to provide support and comfort, and they do provide support and comfort for the patients.
Yeah. Now, another thing I read in the book, that this was another thing that kind of surprised me. I thought was really interesting. I've heard people talk about auras, for example, and when we're not well, our auras are kind of dim or gray or something like that. And in the book, you talk about the chakras as people are getting ready to cross actually become like supercharged.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
when I would think they're like shutting down and getting dim. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it was something that I had, didn't expect. I hadn't ever really thought about, but it was something that I witnessed. Um, I see chakras and auras, and I mean, when I'm doing readings, I see them,
Hmm.
and and I see them also when I'm sitting bedside. And the metaphysical chakras, which are your upper chakras, your heart chakra, your throat chakra, your third eye chakra, and your crown chakra, those are our metaphysical chakras. And they undergo a transformation at end of life. They bloom, they blossom. And it makes sense that they would, because those all represent our consciousness. They represent the metaphysical side. So, you know, there are energetic centers, but they are our metaphysical energetic centers. So
Hmm.
our consciousness is just like blossoming at end of life, and those energetic centers reflect that. So it's yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's anything that's ever been studied, but to me, it sort of intuitively makes sense that that would happen.
Yeah, it did when I read it, but like I said, it kind of surprised me because, again, I heard about auras, and like I said, people, they read your aura and it's like your aura is kind of dim because you're sick or you're depressed or whatever. So I thought that was really interesting and encouraging, that as we approach death, as our bodies are looking, shutting down, and people might walk in the room and say, they're looking terrible. Our spirits are actually, our consciousness is actually raising.
Well, they might look terrible physically,
Yeah,
but now auras are different than chakras,
right.
and I see auras also. And with NDEers, and people who've had spiritually transformative experiences, I usually note that they have two auras. One is their aura around their physical body; it's sort of a physical aura, and um, the way I see auras is I get content from them. So, I might see, it's like a photo album. I might see, oh, there you are when you were 3 years old on your tricycle. And here you are, when you're 12. That's their kind of physical aura. Oh, and here's the trauma you experienced. I see that when you were 32 or something. But I see also with people who've had these transformational experiences, another aura that supersedes that aura, and that's a spiritual aura, and it's filled with white light, and it's protective, and it's sort of invincible.
Hmm.
So, I think there's more to auras than what we might first think of. I think,
Sure.
there's more going on. I see, when I do these expos, I see people have these booths where you can have a picture of your aura. Have you ever
Yeah,
seen those? Yeah.
I've seen that.
Yeah, which I don't understand at all, because they just you get this picture and it's like purple or yellow. Like, I don't know what that means, but I think the takeaway, at end of life is that our consciousness is expanding, and there are different ways that can manifest, through our chakras, through our journeying, um, through, the blossoming of our consciousness, those sorts of things.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about, the dying process, and hopefully we've opened up some people's eyes to how it might be different than they thought. And I do want to encourage people. I do highly recommend the book. And just to get a reminder, it's Diary of a Death Doula: 25 Lessons the Dying Teach Us About the Afterlife. Do you have anything you'd like to leave us with in terms of what we should be doing as we're going through the process ourselves, or as we have a loved one going through the process?
I think, talking about death, I don't think you want to wait to open up the conversation. I think it's, helpful for everyone to have some conversations about end of life and death. I found in hospice that, many patients have never had the conversations. They sort of expressed that they wanted to die at home, but they were afraid to bring up the conversation, or their loved ones were afraid. So those conversations never happened. Um, I think anything we could do in terms of education, in terms of conversation, I think all of that is good. I think it's good to have your wishes known, to bring it up with your families if you can, and to understand. I mean, the bottom line, I think, is to understand that we are more than our physical bodies, and perhaps that will make people feel a little bit more comfortable about what's going on. Um, uh, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I guess that's what I would leave you with. And I want to just say, in terms of the book is coming out, well, it's October now, so it's coming out in October. It should be out in a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
It's available for pre-order on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com and IndieBound. But what we're going to do is, for those of you who read the book, if you write a review on Amazon and send me a screenshot of the review, we're going to do a book club with the author online. So it's, be an exclusive book club, and you'll be able to ask questions, and it'll be interactive. And I think it'll be really nice. So that's, for all your listeners who read it and enjoy it and write your review. And by the way, I mean, this, Brian, on Amazon, you don't have to write a tome, you can write
Right.
5 words.
Right.
Just shoot me a screenshot of the review, and my email is diamond, DIAMOND Debra, DEBRA @gmail.com. So shoot me a screenshot of your review. We'll send you a link for the online book club with the author.
That sounds great. And Deborah, are you taking people for readings?
I do. I read for people all over the world. I think, in the past week or so, I've read for people in Italy and Israel and the UK and South America. I read for people all over the world. I read predominantly through a platform like this, Zoom,
Mm-hmm.
online, and it works just like our conversation is working. You're here, I'm here, we're all here.
Yeah.
So, but I do psychic readings, mediumship readings, medical intuition, and best way to contact me for that is to go to my website, DebraDiamondPsychic.com, and there's a contact page there.
Okay. And I'll put that in the notes, the DebraDiamondPsychic.com. I will tell you, I will definitely be putting my review on Amazon as soon as it's available. Like I said, the book I found to be fascinating. I've read dozens of books about near-death experiences and mediumship and stuff. But I think the perspective that you brought to me, I learned a lot from reading the book. And it's been really fascinating talking with you.
Well, thank you. And, I want to say that, the work that I do as a medium and a psychic is important to me because, and I'm going to use an investment term, I want to move the ball down the field. Mm-hmm. I want to move the ball down the playing field. And so that's why, I do this research. I'm trying to open up some conversations. I'm trying to get that ball moved down the field. And maybe even if it's only incremental, it'll still help. So that's, that really explains, why I'm coming at it the way I do.
Well, I love doing the work that I'm doing and seeing all these people each doing our parts, and I get to interview people like yourself, and it feels to me like it's a growing thing. I hope it is. And as we do this, we can open up and have conversations with people and make them feel more comfortable about something that we're all going to experience.
Yeah, well, I think the work that you're doing is wonderful. You have a great skill, and your communication skills are terrific, and your understanding of all this and the questions you ask, they're all wonderful. So you're putting together your background as well and who you are to do the same thing, from your end. So, I mean, hopefully, we'll all work together to, bring more knowledge and understanding of all this.
All right. Well, thanks. You have a great afternoon.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Talk to you soon. Hey, thanks for watching. Before you leave, I'd like to just remind you, you can always find me at www.grief2growth.com. That's grief, numeral 2, growth.com. And you can schedule a free half-hour consultation if you'd like. Also, before you leave, please click on the like button here, click on subscribe, and click on the bell. By clicking like, YouTube will show the video to more people, and by subscribing and clicking the bell, you'll be notified when I release new material. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.